Picture a typical British high street today. It's a predictable, repetitive loop of coffee chains, bookmakers, and brightly lit vape shops. Everything feels perfectly sanitized and optimized for mass consumption. But rewind the clock just a decade, and tucked right between the generic fast food joints and clothing stores sat an anomaly. A store that looked a bit like an industrial warehouse, smelled faintly of soldering iron rosin, and was staffed by employees who actually knew the difference between an NPN and a PNP transistor. This was Maplin. Maplin was the only place in the UK where someone could walk in off the street on a rainy Tuesday, buy a highly specific 10OHM resistor, a spool of copper wire, and a disco laser, all while having a completely earnest conversation with the cashier about building a custom radio transmitter. Maplin operated as a third place for the technically inclined, functioning as a massive community hub that was cleverly disguised as a national retail chain. The common assumption was that Amazon had just rolled into town with cheaper HDMI cables and effortlessly erased the need for physical electronic shops. It became incredibly easy to accept the convenient story that Maplin was just another retail dinosaur quietly crushed by the digital asteroid. But the reality of the situation is far darker and infinitely more frustrating for anyone who actually understands how retail finance operates. Maplin started out as a practical solution to a massive headache. Back in 1972, electronics was a fiercely hands-on pursuit, but tracking down the parts was an absolute nightmare. Two enthusiasts, Roger Allen and Doug Simmons, were constantly hitting brick walls trying to source basic components for their personal builds. Finding the exact resistor, a specific capacitor, or a specialized vacuum tube meant navigating a highly fragmented and painfully slow supply chain. They decided to bypass all of that and launched a small mail-order business to supply themselves and their fellow hobbyists. They printed a catalog, and that publication quickly evolved into an absolute Bible for makers, engineers, and curious teenagers across the UK. It was packed with highly detailed schematics, project kits, and thousands of niche items, often wrapped in iconic retro-futuristic sci-fi cover art that made building a radio transmitter look like an intergalactic adventure. The demand was so overwhelming that by 1976, Allen and Simmons had generated enough capital to transition from mail-order dispatches to a physical retail space, opening their very first shop in Westcliff-on-Sea in Essex. Walking into a Maplin felt like stepping into a physical manifestation of a master engineer's workbench. They catered specifically to a demographic that wanted to build, repair, and tinker with the mechanical world around them. This hyper-specific focus paid off massively when the home computing boom hit the UK in the 1980s. As machines like the ZX Spectrum, the BBC Micro, and the Commodore 64 invaded British living rooms, an entire generation of bedroom coders and hardware hackers suddenly needed parts. Maplin was perfectly positioned to supply this growing army of tech enthusiasts with the exact ribbon cables, connectors, breadboards, and soldering equipment required to modify their new machines. They rode this momentum and expanded rapidly through the 1990s and into the 2000s, becoming a massive national chain that completely dominated the specialty electronics market. When the dot-com bubble expanded and online shopping launched its hostile takeover of the HighStreet, Maplin barely flinched. They survived that first digital wave because they held one undeniable advantage over the internet: instant access. You simply can't download a blown fuse when your living room suddenly goes dark. A musician isn't going to wait around for next day delivery when they desperately need a specific audio cable 3 hours before soundcheck. When panic sets in, you grab your keys and drive to a physical shop. Maplin completely owned that sense of urgent necessity. That built-in safety net should have made them untouchable, perfectly positioning them to dominate the modern maker movement, the Raspberry Pi craze, and the massive boom in consumer robotics that defined the 2010s. But the true secret weapon that made Maplin iconic was the staff standing behind those counters. Maplin's hiring strategy was built on finding people who actually lived and breathed the hardware. The staff were active hobbyists, late-night tinkerers, and retired engineers who spent their weekends perfecting home-built synthesizers or restoring vintage hardware. This created a retail culture levels above the high-pressure environments of major electronics chains. A shopper could walk in off the street with a smoldering circuit board and find a specialist willing to spend 20 minutes diagnosing a faulty diode, or suggesting the perfect capacitor for a custom project. They focused on solving the customer's technical problem rather than reading from a script to push an expensive extended warranty. This level of expertise turned every location into a vital lifeline for the community. Maplin functioned as the physical headquarters for the right to repair movement, and while their competitors were busy convincing consumers to buy the latest upgrade, the Maplin staff provided the knowledge and the tiny 5-pence parts needed to keep those machines alive. This formula worked perfectly for decades, turning Maplin into a HighStreet powerhouse. And while selling 10-pence resistors might look like small-time business on a spreadsheet, the profit margins on those microscopic components were actually massive. The customer base bought them by the thousands, generating a reliable stream of revenue that made the company a retail fortress. Maplin had become a beloved, cash-rich institution, which unfortunately turned into its curse. By proving exactly how much money was waiting in the maker community, the brand inadvertently painted a giant target on its back for the absolute worst kind of financial predators. In June 2014, the private equity firm Rutland Partners moved in to snap up the company for £85 million in a deal that looked like any other standard corporate acquisition. Rutland's press team immediately issued optimistic statements about unlocking hidden potential and leading the beloved brand into a new era of massive growth. They talked about investing in the customer experience and modernizing the stores for a new generation of makers. The CEO of Maplin at the time, John Cleland, was quoted saying, "Our strategic plans for Maplin represent substantial growth in sales and profit, continuing on the journey already mapped out that focuses on improved customer experience in all key channels, substantially broadening our range of products and innovation, and investing in our ability to offer the best electronics and technical advice to our customers. The management look forward to working closely with Rutland Partners in the future. They bring a wealth of strategic and operational experience which Maplin will benefit from as they support us in our plans to take the business forward." But their acquisition essentially strapped a ticking clock to the business, leaving Maplin fighting for its life from the very beginning. When a private individual buys a house or a car or a business, they typically use their own cash or secure a standard loan based on their personal credit. Private equity firms often operate on a completely different set of rules, with the most infamous being something called a leveraged buyout. When Rutland Partners bought Maplin, they funded the purchase by loading the debt directly onto the company itself. Basically, the buyout was funded by Maplin being forced to take on a massive £72 million loan just so the new owners could take control. To make matters worse, that loan was provided by the new owners themselves, carrying a punishingly high interest rate of 15% per year. Maplin was instantly transformed into a highly stressed vehicle for servicing corporate debt. The company was suddenly burdened with an artificial liability that had nothing to do with selling cables or components. The executives at Rutland Partners had essentially weaponized Maplin's historical profitability, gambling that the stores could generate enough cash to pay off the massive loans while still keeping the lights on. This financial arrangement effectively turned the new owners into the company's most expensive and demanding creditors. The staggering weight of the debt meant that Maplin started every single morning approximately £30,000 in the red just to cover the interest payments alone. The business model at play here focused almost entirely on extraction. By structuring their investment as high-interest loans rather than simple equity, the private equity firm ensured that they sat at the very front of the queue for any cash the business produced. If Maplin thrived, the interest payments were a massive win. If it struggled, those same payments allowed the owners to pull millions of pounds out of the business before any eventual collapse. Maplin was essentially paying its own ransom with money that should have been spent modernizing its digital infrastructure or lowering prices to compete with the likes of Amazon. This pressure forced a disastrous shift in how the stores actually operated on the ground. Management was boxed into a corner, forced to chase immediate short-term cash flow at the expense of their long-term reputation. The shelves began to fill with generic consumer electronics like cheap drones, novelty gadgets, and branded batteries because these items could be marked up more aggressively than a 5-pence resistor. This created a retail death spiral that was impossible to escape. To pay that hefty interest charge, Maplin had to hike prices across the board, and those higher prices drove away the savvy technical customers who knew they could find the same specialized parts for a fraction of the cost online. As foot traffic dropped, the pressure to extract even more profit from the remaining customers intensified, leading to even higher markups. The convenience of walking to a shop and getting expert advice started to look like a luxury no one could afford when a simple HDMI cable was way cheaper on Amazon. Maplin was effectively alienating its only loyal fan base just to keep its head above the rising tide of debt. By 2016, the business was running on fumes. Years of feeding that massive debt mountain had buried the balance sheet under high interest liabilities, leaving the company's cash reserves dangerously low. This internal decay meant the business had absolutely no margin for error. It had become a retail house of cards that could only stay standing if the world around it remained perfectly still. And unfortunately for them, a massive geopolitical storm was gathering on the horizon. In June 2016, the UK voted to leave the European Union, sending an immediate and violent shock through the currency exchanges. For a domestic retailer that bought almost all its inventory in US dollars, the timing was catastrophic. Overnight, the value of the British pound plummeted, and the cost of every single capacitor, drone, and cable in the Maplin warehouse spiked by double digits. This was a total wipeout of their purchasing power. In a healthy company, a currency crash of this magnitude is painful but survivable. A business with a clean balance sheet can use its cash reserves to hedge against the drop or negotiate better terms with suppliers to weather the storm. Maplin didn't have that luxury. Every spare penny was already spoken for, tied up in those 15% interest payments to Rutland partners. They were caught in a vice, with rising import costs on one side and fixed and predatory debt on the other. By late 2017, the financial world began treating Maplin like a high-risk gamble. This collapse in confidence triggered a final, invisible mechanism that effectively guaranteed the company's liquidation. The straw that broke the camel's back was the sudden withdrawal of a boring administrative safety net known as credit insurance. Insurers smelt something was off and effectively gave Maplin a vote of no confidence ahead of the vital Christmas trading period. In the world of retail, this insurance is the oil that keeps the gears turning. It allows a shop to order X number of items without paying a single penny up front. The retailer takes delivery, sells the goods, and pays the supplier 60 days later, with an insurance company guaranteeing that the supplier gets paid even if the shop fails. Insurers looked at the combination of Maplin's debt-heavy balance sheet and the volatile UK high street and simply walked away. The cancellation of that insurance effectively froze the company's entire supply chain overnight. Suppliers immediately refused to ship another box of electronics unless Maplin could produce the full cash amount in advance. For a business already drained by predatory interest payments, finding millions of pounds in liquid capital just to stock the shelves for the critical Christmas trading period was a mathematical impossibility. Chief Executive Graham Harris later went on record stating that this specific combination of factors made raising fresh capital completely impossible. Without the ability to buy stock, the shelves went bare and the final rescue talks began to fail one by one. No sane investor was willing to take on a business suffocating under such a toxic combination of private equity debt and hostile economic conditions. By February 2018, Maplin officially collapsed into administration, leaving a massive trail of destruction and an estimated £150 million owed to creditors. This fall coincided with the collapse of Toys R Us, marking a devastating week for British retail. Physical stores were rapidly liquidated, iconic signage was stripped from retail parks across the country, and the High Street lost its last dedicated haven for the technically curious. At the same time, thousands of knowledgeable staff members, many of whom had spent decades developing specialized skill sets, were suddenly forced onto the job market. Hobbyists, engineers, and weekend makers lost the only resource that allowed them to physically interact with components before buying them. The High Street became significantly more homogeneous, trading a hub of raw creativity for empty units and generic chain restaurants. Logically, the story should end with those empty storefronts. But the modern internet has a habit of reanimating dead brands to squeeze out every last drop of value. If you search for Maplin today, you'll find a slick, fully operational website selling batteries, cables, and security cameras. Business journalists occasionally run headlines about a miraculous comeback and significant profit surges in the digital era. That narrative is mostly a public relations illusion. The Maplin operating today has no real connection to the physical community hubs lost in 2018. Following the collapse, a company called Digital First Retail Limited purchased the name, the logo, and the customer database from the administrators. They stripped away the expensive stores, the knowledgeable staff, and the inventory of niche hobbyist components, and they effectively hollowed out the brand, keeping the name to sell generic electronics online. This new version operates exclusively as an e-commerce platform, and a recent 17% profit surge was the result of a revised digital advertising strategy. It had little to do with customer service or specialized inventory. Their own press releases attribute this financial success to AI-driven targeting across Google Shopping and social media. The system places ads in front of people searching for electronics, banking on the lingering trust and nostalgia of the Maplin name to secure a sale. The demise of Maplin is a sobering case study in how modern corporate finance can dismantle a culture. It's easy to point at Amazon and blame the inevitable shift to online shopping, but that narrative is a convenient distraction. Maplin offered something the internet still struggles to replicate: immediate physical solutions, expert human advice, and a sanctuary for a dedicated community of makers. The business ultimately died because it was suffocated by the very financial mechanisms meant to manage it. By weaponizing the balance sheet and extracting wealth through high-interest debt, private equity left the brand against zero defense against the macroeconomic shocks of the Brexit era. When the credit insurers finally walked away, they were finishing off a business that had already been bled dry. Maplin is a classic retail tragedy where a beloved institution was treated as a financial asset first and a community resource second. But what do you reckon? Do you deeply miss the absolute chaos of an old Maplin store? Or are you perfectly happy buying your electronics through a screen and waiting for next day delivery? Drop your thoughts in the comment section below. We want to hear about the weirdest component or most obscure gadget you ever managed to track down in a physical shop. If you enjoyed this investigative deep dive into the darker side of retail finance, give us a like, hit subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next video. Anyways, cheers for watching and stay curious.